already kind of started. My name's Chase. This is Mason.
You should know who we are.
You should know who we are if you're our colleagues. If not, welcome to a discussion. We're graduate students at Utah State University. We're sitting down here to talk about our master's theses today, both of which focus on Utah, on the social aspects, on some of the environmental aspects, and where our projects sort of cross over. Mine in particular, my working title is Decolonizing Memory, the Silencing and Resurgence of Indigenous History in the Intermountain West. I'm looking at the sort of intersections of settler colonialism and memory history, and this guy knows all of this. We talk about it every day, pretty much, on our commutes to and from school. But yeah, the intersections there. So really what I'm looking at specifically is the history of settlement here, and especially the Ogden area, but whereas Native peoples often didn't live in a sedentary way like we did, that scope kind of expands beyond Ogden to include Weber County and the Intermountain West writ large. Though again, my primary focus is Ogden. And what I'm looking at is how the process of how the pioneer heritage many of us are familiar with has sort of become the dominant narrative, which leaves non-pioneer narratives, especially indigenous narratives and histories, to the wayside. They've been erased, silenced over time. So my thesis looks at the process of how that happened through the histories that have been written, the ones that exist, and the histories that are now starting to be told again through indigenous voices and lenses.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have as good of a title yet. I'm just focusing on wolves in Utah with an environmental history focus. I've kind of bounced around how I even came to this topic. I kind of came to grad school in hopes of maybe continuing what I did in my undergrad, where I studied wolves in Yellowstone at the beginning of the National Park, or the Organic Act of 1916. I've kind of like bounced all over the place. There was a minute where I thought I was going to like compare to India, Yellowstone in India, but realized that was going to be a lot of work. So I noticed through some of like the materials that I was looking at that wolves in Utah haven't been covered that well, or not that they haven't been covered well, just not as much as like other species. So I was focusing on this. I noticed as well that Utah kind of is the last remaining Rocky Mountain state to not have wolves, and current political discussions around wolves is very anti, at least if you look at the politicians that are talking about wolves. And so I was interested in that, and so I've kind of looking at like why Utah stands alone from the rest of these Rocky Mountain states, and I've found some like interesting sources and lenses at which I can look through to kind of like understand this story. Utah prides itself in its agricultural background, as well as what I like to call a pioneer identity, where Utah like really holds to this pioneer heritage that we have. And so I kind of feel like by looking at like the Utah wool growers, that there is an interesting way to see kind of how predator and or just wolves specifically have kind of like suffered at the hands of politicians and agriculturalists.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think that's one of the most interesting sort of crossovers that we have between our research is how we both have come together or come separately to a similar conclusion in regards to what makes Utah unique in its history, and that sort of pioneer heritage, that pioneer identity, pioneer legacy, however you want to word it. I think that comes through in both of our projects really strongly in what makes Utah unique, and what makes our projects sort of unique. We haven't looked the histories that exist both environmentally and in regards to wolves specifically, and also Native histories, indigenous histories. They've all been sort of silenced at the behest of like this sort of dominant pioneer narrative,
Yeah.
that sort of permeates into every aspect of the state's history. And then I guess what we're looking at then is how does that affect the way the culture here in Utah responds to history? Because it sort of influences everything, I think. Like whether you're learning Utah history in 7th grade,
Yeah.
or just through the news, or however you take in your history, like what you're going to get in Utah is like the pioneer narrative almost always. And so how, like in your experience, like how does that impact the way the state sees wolves throughout its history?
Well, when I was kind of first looking at this, I didn't really think that I was going to have as much focus on the pioneers
Right.
as I'm having now. I didn't, but when you look at the history of Utah, it is impossible to not talk about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Absolutely.
It's inevitable that in some way it's gonna.
It has to. Right?
Yeah, how it comes out, and I think that the issue that I have found is, even though that exists, how is it different? At least with wolves, because it seems like with westward expansion, everywhere was eliminating wolves and predators. It wasn't just a Utah specific thing. And more along the lines of like native history, I would also say that that's the same with westward expansion. And I felt like that was one way that our topics are very similar in that regard. But one thing that I've been trying to do is figure out how Utah may be unique. And I think people tend to put the pioneers on a pedestal.
Absolutely.
And they try and say, they look at all the good and things, but they don't want to look at the other consequences as well. And I think that with wolves, that is a very interesting one to look at. And so what I'm trying to do is find a way that to paint Utah unique.
Yeah.
And by paint, I don't mean like like I'm just taking what the sources are giving me.
Totally.
But I'm just trying to show how wolves were impacted, and it is kind of difficult at times. But that's why I've settled on this like pioneer identity, because with westward expansion, everybody was eliminating wolves, but in Utah it was different. That there was like a different element with the pioneers.
That's interesting. And again, that like when it comes to the research I've been doing, you look at again that pioneer identity. You look at the state curriculum for teaching history, right? And you have the first chunk is prehistory up to 1847. So all of the indigenous and native history of the place we now call Utah is put into this one lesson up to 1847. What happens in 1847? The pioneers start arriving in large numbers, and then you have little chunks from that point on in the curriculum that are much more focused. And so when you're looking at a native history of the area, you don't get much. It's all prehistory. Everything for 1847, is prehistory. It's also similar in the way that, settler colonialism in Utah was much the same as it was anywhere else. Take the land, start improving it, try to civilize these people. But what's different is that in the LDS canon, the Native Americans have a different role than in standard Christianity, right? You have them as the Lamanites. And so from the get-go, their relationship, not with the land necessarily, but with Native people, was a little bit different and unique than other places that were being settled, either back east or in the west at the same time, because you have scripture backing up, we need to save these people and bring them back into the Mormon fold, right? That's the sort of goal. And so settler colonialism is different and unique here, despite still having very violent roots and effects that we still see today.
Yeah, and I mean, even in our past discussions, I wish we could somehow
give a cutback.
Yeah, to like moments on our drives where we've like come to the realization of how similar. But there is that one quote that in one sentence from Brigham Young, he like links our topics together.
Absolutely.
And obviously I don't have like the exact quote on me, but he basically stated that there was two things that were prohibiting,
Mormon proliferation.
Yeah, and it was native peoples. He doesn't use that word. And wolves.
Yeah.
And I always found that interesting that those two were lumped together as like the antithesis of progress.
Absolutely. It's so strange because in another source that I'm using quite heavily, it's a history of Weber County that's been produced by the Daughters of Utah Pioneers, which is an LDS sort of focused history organization. One of the first sentences in there is very much echoing that quote from Brigham Young, where it says, two enemies the early cattlemen of Ogden had to contend with were the red men and wolves. I mean, those are the words explicitly. They put them together, you know what I mean? Wolves and Native Americans, just like that, as some sort of hurdle to be overcome by the new pioneers.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, I found that very interesting. And that's where, like, some of my research has shifted is, like I said earlier, I didn't necessarily think that I was going to be, focusing on the church. But, like we've already established, that's nearly impossible. And you mentioned just barely, like cattlemen and stuff. And that's where I started looking at, like, the wool growers and things. And the early church history was very dependent on, their economy for survival. They were kind of, prior to statehood, they were, kind of in a
commune.
Yeah.
To some extent. It
wasn't like a gray area. They were not legally supposed to be there. It wasn't Utah, or it wasn't United States territory. It was still
Mexico.
Mm-hmm. And so they were in this like limbo state, and then they become a state, and they were like trying to survive economically, and this like economic fragility was really what was driving things. And I think that, especially in those early stages, that they really were trying to establish themselves with like their colonial methods.
Yeah.
And wolves and native peoples
were an impediment.
They stood in the way.
Yeah.
I mean, you know better than I do about like how native people subsisted off this landscape, but wolves also, they stood in the way of these flocks and
the livestock.
Yeah.
All of that. And I think it's interesting because in some of the sources I've seen mention, like down in an area now where you don't see like really any wildlife aside from, small birds and mammals. There were wolves, there were deer, there were all of this in an area now that's very much just the built environment at this point.
Yeah.
And so like when you think of Ogden or Weber County or the Wasatch Front, however big you want the scope, regardless of that scope, you don't think of them as sort of like wildlands. Mm-hmm. You don't think of them as like native people lived here once or wolves lived here once. Like that is beyond the pale at this point in time, and at this point in history. Like it doesn't seem likely. And that's sort of what led me to my topic, is like that everywhere was native land. Mm-hmm. Ogden City had to be. So where is it? Like it's not anywhere in the infrastructure. It's not memorialized really anywhere. The sort of mentions that they get within the city histories or within any of the monuments or memorials that are in the city, they're still called like Indians or red men or just like really derogatory terminology that serves to sort of put that pioneer narrative on the pedestal, as you mentioned before. And that's just really interesting to me to sort of see wolves and native people as a sort of parallel in regards to the settlement of Utah. And so what I'm really trying to do with, this project here is I'm not really trying to tell a native history of Ogden. That was sort of the idea I had.
Yeah.
When I first started out, as we're talking about the ways our projects have shifted over grad school, the idea was to do like, a native history of Ogden and get oral interviews from Shoshone, from Goshute, from all the people who called Utah home, and get oral interviews about place names and things like that. It was almost more geographical in nature. But as I continued on, I mean, obviously that's not my place to tell that story, first of all. So what I'm trying to do is sort of tell the story of settlement and how it erased those histories. And then, by the end of the thesis, we're focusing on our first chapter here, but by the end of the thesis, the idea is to bring it into the present with work that's being done with Native peoples, specifically Darren Perry and the Northwest Band of Shoshone Nation. The work that they're consistently doing now to show that these are their homelands, from anywhere from here to Franklin, Idaho, where the Bear River Massacre happened. All of that is their traditional homeland, including Ogden. And so really I'm trying to, the point of my project here is to implore us to sort of re-examine the sources that have been used to write the histories of Ogden, which, by the 1860s no longer mention Native people.
Yeah.
Like you just assume that they went extinct or disappeared or what have you, they just kind of don't exist anymore. And so my struggle has been to find primary sources that show that Native presence through the rest of the 19th century.
Yeah. Kind of like yours, because you had mentioned more contemporary views of Native history and working with Darren Perry. That's kind of what has driven a lot of mine as well. There was a House bill that was brought to my attention in 2020 that's kind of been the driving force behind why I'm researching this. And it's HCR 19, kind of happened during COVID, which is probably why it didn't get as much notice. But it basically just was like a bunch of politicians got together and said, we are saying no to artificial reintroduction of wolves in the state. And that's all it's saying. It's not saying that Utah wouldn't allow wolves, but there is, after looking at the wolf management plan, they'd have to basically tiptoe a very fine line in order to survive.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at kind of that to, why is Utah, politicians, why are they so adamantly opposed to wolves? And who lived here yeah,
before settlement, right?
Yeah,
this is wolf territory.
Yep, historically it is. And it was, there's a bunch of ways that you could look at this. It was very much in response to Colorado, who will reintroduce wolves. So they were just saying that they didn't want that, essentially that federal overreach,
right.
Of the government managing what's going to happen. That was probably the main reason why they passed this. They cited other issues like a crossbreeding between wolves and coyotes, which would kind of be in a gray area of protection. So they're very much looking at how it would impact agriculture, and then also, which is one of the other large economies, is hunting. For some reason, hunters and wolves have never really gotten along.
Right.
They're kind of competition. Numbers would, dwindle and fluctuate, with wolves coming back. But yeah, kind of with you, the contemporary stuff has been, the driving force, and I don't have a lack of sources.
Right.
That is something that it's actually harder than I thought. People are always like, oh, I need more sources, and I'm like, I got
too
way
many.
too many. I at one point joked that I was gonna just cite the entire archives at Utah State, because
right.
I just feel like I've looked at so many different primary sources. The main one has always been like the wool growers, but it seems like I pull in so many others that.
Well,
so I don't have that
same issue.
Yeah.
That has been one of my struggles, is finding primary sources, and some of the analysis in my thesis really is just I'm re-examining these old sources as if they're new primary sources to sort of read against the grain and see what was said or what wasn't said, and how that extrapolates, to my overall thesis, my overall argument. Although I have found some good primary sources that weren't ever used in any of the histories that exist, and they show that the Northwest Shoshone were still coming through in the 1870s, 1880s on a seasonal round. Some lived year round, but some were still doing their seasonal round as they had for thousands of years. And you just don't see that anywhere else in any of the other histories. It's just sort of not talked about. But one thing I did want to sort of hit on was another similarity in the sort of environmental factors between our projects. You've shared sources with me that you're like, oh, I think this will actually help you out, because I have to sort of explain why the economic changes, and to explain the economic changes in regards to indigenous peoples, you have to explain the environmental degradation. Right? And so as you have settlers coming and bringing their vast herds of cattle, ox, horses, sheep, obviously at some point, they are sort of destroying these seasonal lifestyles of Shoshone people, especially. The grasses that they depended on are now being grazed all the way to the root by all of these animals, and now this seed food that we had as long as our people can remember is now gone. And so what do you have to do? You start stealing cattle. You start doing anything to survive, because your traditional lifeways are being completely upended. And that's an environmental story as much as it is a social or history of settler colonialism. And so I wonder how the environmental factor comes into play into yours as well.
Well, because this is mostly an environmental focus. I have a lot of that coming through. While I wouldn't say that environmental history with a Mormon focus is a big thing,
right?
I would say there is some work being done, and I know that you and I have used similar sources, like Jared Farmer's On Zion's Mount has been one that we've both kind of looked at, which he is kind of the go-to when it comes to Utah environmental history. But there's other works that, like you said, I have suggested some that might be applicable. But you mentioned the agricultural aspect. We brought European style of wildlife management and land use with us, whereas native peoples were more subsistent. You mentioned a little more nomadic. They would follow game and things. And we brought in our private lands, and the Homestead Act becomes a big deal.
Of course.
And you had also mentioned the grazing, the sheep would come in and they would
just mow
everything down to the root, which would then introduce weeds and things that weren't useful. And that's how issues arose for forest reserves and the Forest Service, and then you get other federal entities that are created that are meant to manage. So then you get the Biological Survey, the Fish and Wild Game Service, and then you get the national parks. The Antiquities Act allows a president to designate land for preservation, which that has always been interesting to me because that term alone tends to, they've settled on pre-colonial. But then you look at these places and they don't have any mention of
native people.
Of native peoples.
A place unspoiled by man is, I think, some of the wording in that. And it doesn't make sense because by the time, colonizers, colonists, whatever you want to call them, pioneers, by the time they got here, the landscapes they were seeing were completely shaped by native peoples for thousands of years. And they just assumed it was a wilderness completely on its own. without native, land management. But that's just a lie, and I think we see that now in contemporary times. National parks and things who still have issues with forest fires, with all these things that historically weren't problems because there was native land management in place, and they just didn't recognize that as legitimate land management because it wasn't that Western scientified. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The sort of Western knowledge system, it's outside of that, and so they didn't recognize it the same.
Well, and I think especially in Utah, who prides itself on, having 5 national parks.
Right.
And I think people have very much romanticized the idea of national parks.
Absolutely.
I think that the idea of preservation is pure in its intentions.
Sure.
But the way that it's been handled has not been that way. And so I think that, when you look at things like that and you apply like native histories and or predator species such as wolves, which have also had a chaotic relationship within the national parks, which I could spend probably a whole other podcast episode talking about. But yeah, so there's all these, environmental, I guess, aspects that have shaped, why I'm looking at this, have shaped the actual landscape around predators and things. And you've also mentioned about how this has become like a bit of what you're looking at and how it's been influential.
Oh yeah. I think just like at the end of the day, it's really interesting to not only see how our projects dovetail with one another to some extent, but just how much it's sort of enlightened me in like having our discussions about our discrete theses, having the discussions about how they overlap. It just makes me think like Utah history in and of itself is so dynamic, and the histories that currently exist that are at least publicly available and palatable, not these big academic papers or jargon-filled books, but the history that people are actually getting is so boring compared to the reality, and to me it's begging for this sort of resurgence, this sort of fresh eyes looking at these histories and creating a bigger picture history. Like despite the fact that you're looking at wolves specifically, I'm looking at the native history of Ogden specifically. These things tell a bigger story together about the history of settlement here, and how that settlement, like the legacy of that settlement, continues to impact the present, continues to impact the way the policy that's around today, whether it's educational or wildlife management. These sort of historical legacies aren't just in the past. They still influence the way we live our lives today in this state. So that's been like the most eye-opening thing for me overall. For me, it shows like the need for it. Like the public needs an updated history. Yeah, they need access to like a real public history of Utah that is real that is truthful about the violence of settlement, the realities of settlement, what that meant for the land, for the animals, for the people who were already here, all of the above. Yeah. We just need a history that is much more inclusive of all that. And so like us doing this together, that's kind of the vibe I get from it. Yeah.
Well, I think, once all is said and done, we could probably more expertly sit down together and talk about more of the, connections we have, because, we're still working on the first chapters. But even within the first chapter, we've generated, I don't even know how long we've been going.
We've probably been going a half hour.
Yeah, we've generated a pretty good conversation for close to half an hour, just off of like, the
very surface level aspects of our projects.
And I've also felt that our topics kind of are going back to like the more contemporary stuff. Like we both are engaging in projects that are kind of like in the political discussion
for sure
right now. Yeah, and that's a bit intimidating at times because Utah being a very notorious
conservative state.
Yeah, red state is our topics tend to go against that grain a little bit.
Absolutely.
And I think when you said that like it's good for people to get together and update this history, but I can also see us potentially getting some pushback.
Yeah.
But that means that we would have to be like, actively engaging, and like these will probably get put on a shelf and get some dust. But
at the end of the day, I think you're right in the fact that that's just another way that these dovetail, is they go against the grain of the sort of accepted history. If you want a career in wildlife management, you have to be kind of anti-predator at some point, right? In this state, and to be teaching history in this day and age, in the age of culture war, like teaching the real history of settler colonialism and the way it's not just history, the way it continues to influence today. People don't like to hear it, right? We just had Thanksgiving. People don't like to hear that sort of alternate narrative, and so. Yeah, on that account, I think we also have some crossover.
Well, and I think too, like people get going back to that term that we both have different ways of saying it, but I call it the pioneer identity.
Yeah.
People are proud of that here.
For sure.
People, we put the pioneers, like I said, on a pedestal.
Well, there's entire historical organizations.
Yeah.
Centered around pioneer legacy.
And I think that. By challenging that a little bit, people kind of feel like you might be challenging them.
Yeah.
And, a more interesting development in my own project has been the use of some of my own, like, family history in this. And, like, I've always kind of known about it, but I started, like, looking into it, and I realized how much more connected I am to this story than I originally thought.
Mm-hmm.
And, by dissecting, how pioneers treated native peoples, how pioneers treated predators, wolves specifically, because that's what I'm focusing on. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like any guilt behind that. I wasn't alive. I wasn't responsible for that.
Absolutely.
So I'm hoping that in some way people can gain from our projects. I'm not that we're like attacking them personally.
Right.
But this is just a deeper look into Utah's history so that we can better understand the state.
Yeah, and
something that we can still be proud of.
Yeah, and move forward. And I have to mention that in my paper. Now we're getting a little long-winded here, but I have to mention that in my paper, because people are going to take offense to some extent. They might take it personally, and I have to state explicitly, like, the hardships and the struggles that the pioneers went through as they came this way, in the 1800s. That's not anything to like laugh at. Those were real struggles. They went through a lot, and that deserves to be acknowledged and commended to some extent. However, it's not the only history. It's not the full story. You know what I mean? Like, we have to broaden these horizons. Like, it's not a personal attack, but we have to look at the whole picture in order to move forward in a way that is beneficial to the largest number of people, largest number of beings, whether it be the environment, animals, or people, right? Like, it just has to be a more truthful way of going forward. And I think that's kind of what both of our projects are doing, is sort of looking at this history in hopes of moving forward in a better way, through analysis of the past.
Yeah, well. This almost sounded like some of our car drives up to Logan.
Sounds like our commutes up to Logan, yeah. I'm sure we both have plenty of writing to do, so maybe we should get to it.
Yeah.
Thanks for checking it out.